This week's topic is conversion for the sake of marriage. And as we have been doing these last weeks, been covering topics that have been discussed in halacha, that have a long tradition. These are not new topics, but the way that the rabbis in the responsive literature have dealt with them is new. We've been looking at different pivots in the way that the poskim, the halachic decisors, have looked at some of these issues. The example I always come back to is when we talk about electricity. We talk about it being fire, we talk about it being other aspects of Shabbos, but they didn't have electricity until 120 years ago, so they couldn't deal with it. We've been looking at topics that had certain precedents in the Talmud, in previous halachic literature, but contemporary times caused them to be reevaluated. So, for example, when we looked at the idea of the seeing eye dog, bringing animals into shul. We go back far enough, and we talk about the reverence for a synagogue. Nothing that we do in a shul today would probably pass muster 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, but times have changed. The synagogue now is built as a conditional sanctuary space so that you can have kiddush there. Because what would you do if you have a shul without a kiddush? And once you're doing other things, now you can then maybe, if it's facilitate people to go to shul, the person who's blind needs a seeing eye dog. All right, so we make accommodations. Although even into the 20th century, you still had rabbis who felt it's not Jewish to own a dog. I leave that to the dog owners or dog haters to figure out. So the topic that we're talking about this week has to do with conversion for the sake of marriage, which seems to be addressed very directly by the Mishnah. It seems to be asked and answered. It's in source number 1, where it talks about that someone who has been suspected of being engaged in an illicit relationship with a non-Jewish maidservant. And remember, back in the times when there was the slavery, if a Jew owned a non-Jewish slave, they call it Eved Kanani or a Shifcha Kananis, then if that slave was set free, they became Jewish. That was the procedure of slave ownership. Slave ownership was the beginning of conversion, so that if the slave was set free, they could then enjoy the rights of being Jewish. Now, there's also the idea that they would never be free, Olam Bahem Tavodu, but in general, the way it worked was that if you have a non-Jewish slave, the slave is set free, they become Jewish. So here you had a non-Jewish woman who was the slave, and you're suspected, there's a suspicion that the owner had an illicit affair with her. Then she's set free, now she's Jewish. Well, the affair was illicit when she was a slave and not Jewish. Now she is Jewish. What happens to this woman? So the Mishnah says he may not marry that woman, since this will strengthen the suspicions against him. Right? This was illicit to begin with. You're not allowed to marry her. Once she's now respectable, you still can't marry her. But if he did marry her, the judges of the court do not remove her from him. They do not require him to divorce her. So you seem to have a situation of a man, a Jewish man, who has a relationship with a non-Jewish woman, and that non-Jewish woman then becomes Jewish. The Mishnah says very explicitly they can't marry. The Mishnah then says if they do marry, then they don't have to divorce. So it would seem to be asked and answered that if there's a relationship between a Jew and a non-Jew that precedes the conversion of the non-Jew, once the non-Jew converts, no marriage. If they do get married, they don't have to divorce. Now the question is, how does that happen? Or if they do get married, that's kind of a little bit harder to explain. This probably requires a separate class in and of itself. What does it mean to be Jewishly married? Right, so if I'd ask you, what does it take to be Jewishly married? How do two Jews get married? Okay. Chuppah, right? Chuppah, kiddushin, what? Right, there's a religious procedure that takes place for a Jewish man, Jewish woman to get married. So what essentially it would seem to mean is that they can't go through that. But then if they can't go through that, how do they get married? Okay, so maybe it could be that once they're Jewish and they live together, then they're married. This is part of a whole conversation about what happens if a Jewish man and Jewish woman live together without chuppah, without the religious ceremony, but they just live together. Are they considered halachically married or not? So it's a larger discussion. It touches upon the issue of civil marriage. which will come up here as well, that is civil marriage considered a binding marriage for two Jews to require a get, a religious divorce, and has all sorts of ramifications. But essentially, it is possible to have a Jewish man and a Jewish woman who are not supposed to get married to each other that end up being married to each other, and once they're married, they don't have to divorce. You have the same situation in some other cases. If a Kohen marries a divorcee, for example, Kohen can't marry a divorcee. Kohen can't marry a convert either. Another discussion. But if they are married, let's say they don't tell the rabbi who they are, right? Let's say a rabbi just officiates not knowing anything. Rabbis are not supposed to do that, but if the rabbi does that, they're married, they don't have to get divorced. So the same idea here, but it seems that we have this situation asked and answered. But when we dig a little bit more deeply, so Rashi talks about what's the rationale for this. What's the problem here? Right? So lo yisa ena, Rashi says, mishum laz shelo yomru emes haya hakol harishon. Remember, the Mishnah is talking about a situation where they weren't walking around hand in hand as if they had a relationship. There was a rumor that this man and this Jewish man and this non-Jewish slave had a relationship. If she is now Jewish and then gets married to him, what will people say? The rumor was true. So this isn't that they had a relationship, that they were, we're talking about a slave and the master. They weren't walking around hand in hand hosting dinner parties together. It was something that was illicit that there was a rumor about. So Rashi says they can't get married afterwards because it proves the rumor was true. So this then has to start sparking in our heads. Well, what happens if you're not dealing just with a non-Jewish slave and the master? Let's say it was just two individuals, one Jewish, one non-Jewish. Maybe this mission is very specific to the case where there's a rumor that would be confirmed if they marry once she becomes Jewish. And this is further mentioned because Rav Asi later says in the Gemara, second Rashi source number 2, time of the Masiyus Mishum Dekasiv Haser Mimcha Ikshus Peh Ulzus Vasayim Harchek Mimeka. Also, right? It seems Rashi feels that the Mishnah is presenting a case that the subsequent marriage of the maidservant, once she's Jewish, to this Jewish master would just prove the rumors. And we don't want to, and that's this idea of laws. There's a verse in Proverbs, in source number 3, right? Put crooked speech away from you, keep devious talk far from you. This is all about feeding the rumor mill, says Rashi.
I mean, the language of the Mishnah is don't do it.
Okay.
It doesn't say that the marriage is not toe-face.
Fine, correct. So again, first it is toe-face, but the question is, it works. It works. But Rashi seems to say the whole problem in the first place has to do with this rumor mill being fed, right? And that's why the Ramban says source number 4. That's why the Mishnah says, "I feel we're also concerned that people would say that this freed slave, who's now Jewish, they're going to say she converted for him, right? So Ramban expands the idea. We're really here, if we look at the text of the Mishnah, it seems to be that a convert who's a non-Jew who's in a relationship with a Jew who converts can't marry the person they're in a relationship with. That's the Mishnah. Rashi and the Ramban seems to introduce the rationale. This is about feeding the rumor mill, which could mean if there's no rumor mill, maybe it's okay. Or it could mean that we're worried that people will think that she only converted for the marriage. But let's say she didn't. So again, the Mishnah seems absolute. Rashi and Ramban open up some possibilities for leniency. For the most part, as we'll see, the Mishnah is understood as it states. If you convert for a relationship, you can't marry that person. Now, conversion within Judaism was a lot less prevalent from a halachic perspective. It wasn't expected to happen. We're kind of jumping around. The Mishnah seems to indicate that if she converts from marriage, you can't marry the Jew. You fast forward to contemporary times, most conversions are within the context of a relationship. So, spoiler alert, this happens. But how did we get there? So the Rav Chaim Ozer Brzezinski, he was the last major chief rabbi in Vilna. You see, he lived 1863 to 1940. When we talk about the the Jewish world of pre-war Europe, right? You had different sections of Europe that were dealing with modern issues at different times, right? It was Central Europe, Germany, France that dealt with it first in the Enlightenment, right? But at that time, you go all the way to further east into Poland and Russia, they didn't deal with the issues as much, except in the bigger cities. The bigger cities were faster to modernize and lead to these assimilationist questions. So Chaim Ozer Grodzinski was addressing this issue in Vilna, big city, and he was really the destination, the address for a lot of the people who were in the more modernizing places asking them what to do. And then you also have the way the German rabbis in Central and Western Europe were dealing with this. It was much more of a reality because Jews had been integrated. So Rav Chaim Ozer Grodzinski very famously dealt with this issue on numerous occasions. It's really much his addressing this issue has really shaped contemporary approach of the rabbis. So he was asked, Nishalti, right? He says he was traveling. The question reached him in Wiesbaden, right? The rabbis used to take summer vacations at the spas. B'noch Rishon Yiseis Yisrael b'derech civili, civil marriage. So you had a Jew and a non-Jewish woman who married a Jewish man with a civil marriage. But America, right? America, land of the free, home of the brave. Right? So now she wants to convert. The husband and wife, according to civil law, now she wants to convert. And you basically said, maybe we can allow this, right? The Mishnah that we saw, source number 1 says absolutely not. But you want to suggest maybe you can, because if not, let's say we don't do the conversion, Telech Levesin shall reform her. She'll do it outside of halacha, right? In America, they had more reform. It will be a fake conversion. But you say that the Rabbi Posen, one of the German rabbis, well, it doesn't say where he's from. Rabbi Posen would be strict on this. Those who would be against, you want to say do it, because if you don't do it, she's going to do it anyway from the reform ceremony. But Rabbi Posen says don't do it, because she does it, it's only for marriage, and then she's not going to keep mitzvahs afterwards, and you shouldn't get involved in this. On the one hand, do it because she's going to go to reform. On the other hand, don't do it because she's not really sincere. Well, the Dina, Kepas Allah B'Shal is going to Reb Chaim Sanz. He says Reb Chaim Sanzer talks about this case. The Asura Lichnos Kmosha Asur Harashba. You can't let her become Jewish, because you can't, technically, the Mishnah says you can't marry the convert who converts for a relationship. And he says at the end though, B'Shal Shuz Divrei Chaim, Masich Livasof Litzadei B'Ofen Sheish Lachush Kedei. But he says, but they're already married. They're living together. She's not Jewish. If she becomes Jewish, well, you're not supposed to marry the convert for a relationship, but at least you now have 2 Jews. Especially as like Hirsch pointed out, you shouldn't do it, but if it's done, it's done. Let's face it, this is not an ideal situation already. You're facing a couple that's married already civilly. They may go to the reform. They may, maybe you should just do this so it's better than it is now. So you take the high road, you take the low road. You take the ideal, you take the less ideal.
So therefore, if you have put somebody a plate of chazer and you say you're hungry, you got to eat it, then you say, well, you might as well have berachas hamazon after, because you ate it already.
But what we're talking about here, if that's all there is to eat. Remember, right. That's what's on the plate here, though.
Even though that's all there is to eat, that doesn't mean you make berachas hamazon. Maybe you could eat it not to starve.
Okay, so here you have.
What a harsh analogy.
But again, remember the Gemara, the Mishnah presents as if they do get married, you don't have to divorce. The Gemara presents a l'chachila b'diavad hierarchy here. Do you follow the ideal hierarchy, or do you follow the b'diavad hierarchy? Can you say that a situation of a Jewish man married to a non-Jewish woman who are living, who are civilly married, and again, the civil marriage doesn't make any sort of difference? That was the question. So now we're going to unpack it from a couple of halachic precedents, the way conversion was looked at in general. And a major way of doing that, I think, is the Rambam, because we know what conversion is. Conversion to Judaism is if someone who is not Jewish decides to be Jewish and they accept Judaism and they go to a mikvah. If it's a man, there's a circumcision. That's conversion, right? It can't be, sprinkle the holy water. There has to be a process. We know that there's milah for a man, there's tevilah for everybody, and there's kabbalas hamitzvos that has to be accepting the mitzvos. Again, it's not conditional. Doesn't mean accepting the mitzvahs doesn't mean the first sin they do they're not Jewish, but it has to be genuine kabbalas and mitzvahs. Usually, the way we understand accepting the mitzvahs and conversion is that a person has some idea of what they're accepting. Right? If anyone's ever been at a conversion, what usually takes place is the rabbis ask the prospective convert about accepting Judaism and to talk about some of the mitzvos. Usually that meeting isn't taking place until there's some sense of the person having experienced Judaism. Usually the person who taught the convert has, they spend time in a shul. It's not kind of off the street. That's usually the way the process works. Some are stricter, some are more liberal, but in general, you have to have a process. But the Rambam addresses a question that many people have, right? How did Samson marry how do you have all these women? How did Shlomo HaMelech, if he had 1,000 wives, they're not all Jewish? How did that work? So the Rambam in source number 6 is a translation of some of what he talks about. One should not think that Samson, who saved the Jewish people, and Solomon, king of Israel, who's called the friend of God, married Gentile women who did not convert. Instead, the matter can be explained as follows. The proper way of performing the mitzvah is when a male or female prospective convert comes, we inspect his motives for conversion. Perhaps he's coming for the sake of financial gain in order to receive a position or authority, or he desires to enter our faith because of fear. For a man, we check whether he focused his attention on a Jewish woman. For a woman, we check whether she focused her attention on a Jewish youth. We find no ulterior motive. We inform them of the heaviness of the yoke of the Torah and the difficulty the common people have in observing it, so they will abandon their desire. Right? We don't want to make it easy. We're all familiar with that. If they accept the introduction, do not abandon the resolve, unless we see that they're motivated by love. We accept them. Right? You want to make sure it's sincere. For this reason, the court did not accept converts throughout the reign of David and Solomon. In David's time, they sought to convert because of fear. In Solomon's time, they feared they were motivated by sovereignty, prosperity, and eminence, which Israel enjoyed. Right? Maybe they wanted to be Jewish for, the king during the Davidic and Solomonic times. It was good to be a Jew, right? Sometimes it wasn't good to be a Jew. They refrained from accepting such converts because a Gentile who seeks to convert because of the vanities of this material world is not a righteous convert. Nevertheless, there were many people who converted in the presence of ordinary people during the era of David and Solomon. The Supreme Sanhedrin would view them with skepticism. Since they immersed themselves, they would not reject them, but they would not draw them close until they saw this outcome would be. Rambam says that the rabbis weren't doing conversions, but you don't need rabbis to do conversions. If you have 3 observant Jewish males overseeing the conversion, the rabbis would not reject them, they'd be skeptical. What would be the determination? If they saw what the outcome would be. So if the person who converted, even though the rabbis weren't doing conversions and had the proper mechanical conversion process overseen by 3 observant males, if they start coming to shul and keeping kosher, the rabbis would have no choice but to accept because they were Jewish. If they were walking around chazer treif, they would be more skeptical and they wouldn't accept it. So, and the Rambam continues, Solomon converted women and married them, and similarly, Samson converted women and married them. It's well known they converted only because of an ulterior motive. Their conversion was not under the guidance of the court. Hence, the Tanakh considered it as if they were Gentiles and remained forbidden. Right? The Rambam is saying the fact that when they talk about the foreign women of Samson and Solomon, they were called foreign women because they were not fully endorsed by the rabbis. And moreover, their conduct ultimately revealed their initial intent. Those women didn't necessarily remain Jewish. For this reason, our sage says converts are as difficult for the Jewish people to bear as a leprous blemish. For most converts convert for an ulterior motive and later cause Jews to stray. It's difficult to separate from them once they have converted. So the Rambam is acknowledging, essentially the less ideal conversions do exist. And a less ideal conversion is a conversion, unless it becomes very, very clear that the person left. So if taking the Rambam, and the Rambam himself relied upon this. Source number 7 is the Rambam in a halachic responsum, The rabbinical court must do this bad report, force him to remove her or to emancipate and marry her. The Rambam is talking about the case that we saw in the Mishnah, right? Non-Jewish slave woman, Jewish slave master, relationship, she's freed, she's Jewish, and the rabbinical court has to say, no, you can't marry her. Even though this is akin to a sin, because one who's rumored to have slept with a slave woman may not ab initio, lechatchila, ideally marry her. We've already ruled several times on cases such as this that he should emancipate and marry. We do this to pave the way for those who wish to repent. And we say that it's better for him to eat the sauce than to eat the actual fats. You talk about eating non-kosher. All right, he's eating the gravy of the chazer. He's not eating the chazer itself. We rely on the words of the sages. It's time to act for the God. They've reached your Torah. Eis lasos lashem heferu Torah sef. We subtly and softly help him marry her. We set a time by which he must marry her or remove her, as Ezra did. Right? You set up a situation. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, at least you tried. So we see the Rambam taking the precedence of the women, the foreign women of Shlomo and Shimshon, and saying, look, they tried to convert them. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. When it didn't, it's as if they didn't convert. But there is a conversion, and that conversion can't be rejected out of hand. You have to see what happens. So take that situation, the Rambam's saying, take it back to our case. If you have a conversion for marriage, it could be done. It could be less than an ideal conversion, but what happens afterwards? So let's go now back. We saw the question raised by Reb Chaim Ozer Grzinski about the American situation. He quoted Reb Chaim of Sands. He quoted a couple other opinions. Let's go back into these responses. Reb Chaim Halberstam of Sands, he's writing, in Eastern Europe in the 19th century, where things were more traditional. So when he's asked this question, for him, it sounds very strange because he's not encountering modernity on a daily basis. People are asking him for his halachic opinion because he's a halachic expert, not because he's encountered it. So, but the case was the Baal Milchama Shabal Nachmis. He had a Jewish soldier who found a non-Jewish woman. What does it sound like? It sounds like the Eshes Yafas Toa, right? It sounds like the captive bride a little bit. But it's not just that there's a lustful encounter. Haya lo mimena banim. They have children. It's like these soldiers were brought home the Vietnamese brides with the families. Now he's been released from the army several years later. And now the woman converts. So now he wants to marry her. So here you have a case that the rabbis are, here she converted, and now the rabbis say you can't marry because the Mishnah says you can't marry. What do you do? So tshuva, source number 8, the bottom of the second page. We can find permission here, leniency. Right? We said before that Rashi said that the problem for this is that you would be confirming the rumors. Right? Right? So you also, maybe she's not converting legitimately. Right? So we're going down the fourth line of the answer for 4 lines from the bottom. Here, look at the situation. He has a non-Jewish wife who now converts, and they have this family dynamic. And the only thing, the only problem is this Mishnah, which also has rationales that don't apply here. Okay, maybe we can do the Isser Kal. It's just an itty bitty violation. It's a smaller violation than a serious violation. Many have leaned to being permissive in this case. Even though the Knesset Hagdola was stricter. Right, at the end of the day, after the fact, you don't have to divorce her. Achas v'shalom lahatir zeh b'poshut rak achrei haskamas rabbanim d'bedina sechem misaviv v'yeshalom. But you definitely can't make this a proactive policy unless without the rabbis all agreeing. So again, we saw the Mishnah, which is negative about this possibility. We saw the opening rationales can be overcome if it seems to be more legitimate. We see the Rambam's invoking the quote unquote fake conversions of the wives of Shlomo and Shimshon. At the same time, recognizing, let's see, the proof is in the pudding. Let's see what happens afterwards. You have the Rambam endorsing this as a legitimate policy, Bidi Evan, and you see a case in the 19th century of the war bride, Rabbi Chaim Sanz, allowing this, but not necessarily making this a proactive policy. Now, remember, in the 1900s, certainly in Sanz and most other places, you didn't generally have the situation you have today of the Jewish boy and non-Jewish girl meeting in college, falling in love, wanting to convert. You don't have that bit yet. You don't have Rabbi Chaim Halberstam endorsing that yet. He does say the rabbis are going to have to deal with this to permit it more often. But he's saying, again, chas v'sholom lahatir. He's not seeing this as a proactive policy.
Nevertheless, it's still pretty forward thinking.
Correct. Correct. That's why this is remarkable response. So we have a case in the Mishnah that seems very narrow. However, the fact that it's based on certain rationales that don't always apply, because it's not always about a suspected illicit affair, and it could be the convert is valid. There's two strikes against the case in the Mishnah. If you don't have those two strikes, there seems to be more room for, at least after the fact, allowing it, as per Shimshon and Shlomo, and then the Rambam and Reb Chaim Sanz also. So the Achiezer, let's go back to the way he answered the question. Remember, he's asked about a case in America, they're civilly married, can they convert? Maybe they go to the Reform. What do we do? So the source number 9. Right? What happens if she's in love with a Jewish man? Yeah, Yosef, you have to base it on what the rabbis think. Depends, right? Just because a Jewish man and a Jewish woman comes a non-Jewish woman comes to a Jewish boyfriend, or the other way around, the rabbis have to decide whether her intent goes beyond it. Right? The term we use now is the relationship might be a catalyst, but it's not the cause. It's not the final determination. The Rabbi Chaim Ozer Grozitsky says it's up to the rabbis to determine this. Right? Let's say you're not sure if yesh makom mistavi yesh lo kawal l'shem bishus in mekabel. So the after the dafka b'nisbar lebezin sheyesh sham la il acheres ein mekabel. Really, you have to know for sure that she's converting for the marriage. It's like, is she marrying for the money? Is she converting for the marriage? You have to investigate. You ask, you question, you put them in separate rooms and interrogate. The lonis barlen, you can't prove that it's for marriage only. It might be legit. Remember, let's say the intent wasn't legitimate. We said after the fact it's still acceptable. So you should be doing this ideally. He says if you're not sure, and it seems that it might be as a relationship, but she also seems genuine, you can go ahead, not lichatchila, because we're not happy about this, but you are able to go forward. He's taking it a little bit further than Reb Chaim of Sanz. Once you've investigated, remember, Reb Chaim of Sanz was dealing with the case presented to him about a war bride. He wasn't thinking about the more integration or the ability of Jews and non-Jews to meet. Achiezer says the rabbis have to make a determination. They have to investigate. They have to do due diligence. And if you can't prove one way or the other, she seems sincere, you can go forward. Right? You don't accept anyone who comes for marriage for gerus. Right? He's reviewing that based on the Mishnah precedent, you can't do this. right? And what about the case in this case here with the civil marriage? Shema Tavo lived a reformer. It's a reformer, right? It's clearly not going to be a conversion, real halachic conversion by the reform, right? Because they're not going to accept the mitzvos, right? And it's not a good bezdin, and it's not going to be there. He says well, that's not really a concern. Let them go to the reform. That's not a reason to let them come to the Orthodox. But if she seems sincere, then you have an ability to set aside the reservations introduced in the Mishnah. He says it's not like the situation of, eat the sauce or not the fat. He's like, look, don't accept it if she's not going to be legitimate. But he introduces a very interesting distinction here. We're saying that if a woman wants to convert for marriage, you can't accept it. Here, the non-Jewish woman is not converting for marriage. Why not? They're married. They're already civilly married. So she doesn't need a conversion to be married.
They want to be accepted.
No one says you can't convert to be accepted. You can't convert to be married.
If she's not converted, even though technically she's married, but they're not viewed.
So he again, person says, I want to convert, and there's no evidence that he just wants to convert. For the contrary, you accept it. Okay, near Delfiros and Bezdin, the Bezdin can analyze. You'd be able to do this. He says again, the rabbis of the Bezdin have to make a determination. We'll see Rav David Tzvi Hoffman in a minute, but Rav Chaim Ozer Grudzinski seems to say, correct. For the marriage to be recognized by Jews, it has to be. But right now, you have a couple that's happily married. They're happily civilly married. He's clearly not the most religious guy in the block. He clearly didn't care enough that he civilly married a non-Jewish woman. If that's the case, the rabbis can analyze the situation. That's not a conversion for the sake of marriage. Because it's not for the sake of marriage, it's for the sake of being Jewish and being Jewishly married. It's splitting hairs, but it's not illegitimate, because clearly this guy didn't care that she wasn't Jewish to get married, and they're going to start a family anyway. So you have the idea of the Dina de Malchusa Dina, the Jew living under a civil law, under whatever, German law, American law. In this case, the question was asked about America. That it actually changes the situation. It's not necessarily conversion for marriage because they're already married. This whole idea, and we've come across this before, the role of the legal authority to impact halacha. And so here, the very fact that they are legally married may mean that it's not conversion for marriage. It's conversion for Jewish marriage, but they don't need to be Jewishly married because it's not necessary anymore. Because you can be civilly married. It would, once upon a time, if the only way to be married was halachically married for the Jew, then that would be converting for marriage. But they're not converting for marriage. If she wants to convert, since they're already married, there might be some legitimate Jewish interest here, and that's what he says. The rabbis have to decide. We spoke about this with regards to the halachic impact of a legal decision. I think we mentioned that last week in the Titanic. There was a number of Jews who died in the Titanic, and there were one or two aguna type situations. Right, the husband's dead, the wife was still there. Some of them, the couples died, like Strauss. And in one of the, so there was a tshuva written about the Titanic, and one of the rationales for allowing the wife to remarry was that she had been informed by the Russian government, your husband is dead. And he felt that was a legal determination that was not biased in any way, and that fit the halachic criteria to help prove that halachically the husband is dead. And so you have something similar here. If they're legally married, then the conversion isn't for marriage anymore. Potentially, Rav Chaim Ozer is not saying the rabbi should just give her a free pass, but they're saying you don't have to look at this as for conversion for married if they're legally married.
So then some couple would say, well, I'll get civilly married and then I'll be looked upon in a different way, that I'm not converting for marriage. So they would.
Okay, so again, you see, he points out, Ra'os Eine Bezdin. They're going to have to analyze it, but, and if that's really the case, then they can reject it. But we're saying now that civil marriage might remove this from being conversion for the sake of marriage.
Right.
Well, David Tzvi Hoffman takes it a little bit further. Source number 10.
Rabbi,
Yeah,
do we still hold by turning them away 3 times, like over 3 years, or?
no one ever says 3 times 3 years. They
I
say that you
learned
have to
that.
show them how difficult it is. And you have to make sure they're aware that it's not easy. But the idea of that could be an interesting. We do a series on kind of like how certain practices developed, even though they don't have real sources. That would be one of them.
Okay, I
so
think it was
you
practiced by
certainly added
Misrata
something.
Datot. I think it was practiced in Israel by the Misrata Datot,
The
maybe 40 years ago, but that's how it
By the
was.
way, the 3 times 3 years thing, I never heard that before.
Yeah.
But
No.
Okay,
but again, it's about dissuasion and discouragement.
okay.
So what about? So now Reb David Tzvi Hoffman is dealing with this. He's Germany, so he was more culturally encountering this in terms of the Jews being citizens and be more integrated into non-Jewish society. Question: if you're allowed to accept l'kabel giyoresh shekvar nises liyisrael b'giyuso aydei arko. So he's civilly married. It's the same idea. He hasn't called civil marriage. So he quotes the Beis Yitzchak, she'ein l'kabel giyoresh shenivla liyisrael shas l'kon sayishin parichos. He says you shouldn't do it because Mishnah says non-Jewish woman, Jewish man have a relationship. She can't marry you after she's Jewish, right? But then he quotes Rav Shalom Kutna, who says it's okay. Yad ki nasu hakishurim al pi din hamalchus. He says, look, they're married. So if they're married, she's not married. She's not converting for marriage. Lo yuchlu take moseros hakishurim b'li arkos. V'yesh v'zakama menius chashav kidiev v'tiskar kedin tarva ken yikachu kadas moshe Yisrael. He said that marriage is significant enough to turn this into a b'diavad situation. Remember, the Mishnah says once they're married, you don't divorce them. So he's quoting this Rav Shalom Kutna saying that if they're civilly married, that counts as something already that you're not gonna. That it's as if they're married already. You're not gonna force them to divorce you. The fact that they're married even before she's Jewish is enough to say that once she becomes Jewish, they're already married, and you don't have to divorce. He's not saying that the civil marriage is Jewish marriage, but he says the civil marriage creates marriage to make the situation b'diavad so that you can continue and convert her. Hadav Rebbeinu going bal shasus even yikara. So for the simon Toriyase, how we do our own mizeh vevi sham b'shem chachmei Eretz Yisrael sheposkim kim shekvar nasu zel zebeni musehen havikidin of arvikines. Right, he says that the rabbis in Israel who felt that this overcomes the hesitation or the rejection or the prohibition that we have in Yevamos. Right, so that Yevamos Mishnah is really where everything starts, and it's a question of whether it can be overcome, whether it can be ignored, whether it's b'diavad, etc. Well, I tend to agree. Maybe had the Beis Yitzchak understood that if there was a real civil marriage, maybe he would see this as a b'diavad situation. But let's say it was before they were civilly married, and they come to the rabbi to convert. And he rejects them because he sees this as conversion for marriage. He says if they then go a little bit like Leslie's case, they go from the rabbi's office where they were rejected for her to engage in conversion, they go to City Hall and get married, then they can't go back to the rabbi and say, no, it's b'diavad now. That doesn't work. They'll get civilly married. And then they're going to have to get the rabbis will have to say, Mazel Tov afterwards. You can't have this as a workaround. Especially if allowing this leads to more Jews marrying non-Jews. You should really not accept converts in this type of a scenario for marriage. Muvan me'elav shezarach lezas kamas kol harabanim hayireim. This requires more rabbinic, technically unanimity, which you'll never get, but it requires more rabbinic agreement as to do. Because basically, what Rav David Tzvi Hoffman is saying, that if they're civilly married already and then they come to convert, he can see allowing it to take place. But he does not want this to become a workaround for Jews and non-Jews to intermarry and then force the rabbis to do the conversion. And he even suggests maybe banning such conversions, but to do so is not just one rabbi saying it. It's almost in a way like in the Syrian community, they have a takana against conversion. So again, this was how we went from the Mishnah, very negative, through recognizing the Rambam pointing out that this was something that had been, that had been addressed with Shlomo and Shimshon, and we can see it coming up again once Jews and non-Jews are encountering situations where the Jew is having a non-Jewish spouse. How to bring that in. Civil marriage added a whole new concept, especially the idea that if they're civilly married, then the conversion isn't for marriage purposes. And then Rav David Tzvi Hoffman recognizing, but we can't let this be the workaround, civilly married and then go straight to the automatic or more straightforward conversion, because that's not the appropriate way of doing it. You know, as I said earlier on, these days in the Orthodox community, certainly in America, most conversions are within the context of a relationship. And it goes back to what Rav Chaim Ozer Grodzinski said, to try and separate the desire of the non-Jew to convert, that the relationship can be a catalyst, but it can't be the cause. And that seems to be reality. And it has been pointed out that, you know, on some level, the conversions are often more successful when they're within the context of a relationship, because when a person does it alone, it's harder to do it alone. You're all alone. You don't have a network. And that's something that, always make conversion harder, because the convert is all alone trying to make it happen. Now, there are certainly individuals who convert and they find networks and they find friends and they find shuls and everything like that. But, you have a single man, single woman in their 20s converting, and 10 years later, no one wants to give them the time of day because they're a convert, because they're from outsiders. It's not so simple. You have someone who's coming from within the context of a relationship. 6 months after the conversion, they're married, they have in-laws and outlaws, and a larger network. It sometimes does work, but again, this requires the analysis that it's not for the marriage. But if you look at I'm sure you could analyze the numbers based on you could ask the Batei Din what their numbers are, but in my experience, it's basically 9 out of 10 these days are for relationships. Yes. Although that includes, by the way, also sometimes their children that are already part of a relationship. So that that skews the numbers higher. I'd have to think hard about when the last time there was a single individual who was part of a conversion process. I mean, I've had them, but not recently. I mean, back in the city, it was probably maybe 2 out of it was 8 to 2. Now it's 9 to 1. Huh?
So I said a brach to the urine.
Yeah.
So 2 questions.
Yeah.
First of all, why is there no differentiation if the convert is